All right, welcome everyone to our meeting today. Excited to have our guest here. I'll introduce her just momentarily, but if you want to just join me in the brief word of prayer. Father God, we thank you for your presence with us today, for your faithfulness in bringing us to today. We thank you for the opportunity to learn together and to use our minds to help people, to enrich our understanding of the world and how you've created us. I pray that the next hour would be fruitful and meaningful towards that, and then we would be able to have meaningful discussion with one another, to learn things that we can take into our research, into our clinical work. And we just thank you for the opportunity to learn together, to understand more about how you've made us as human beings and how we can pursue lives that are full of meaning, vitality, and abundance. We love you. Amen. All right, so I will introduce our speaker for you today. So Dr. Katelyn Long, her current work is focusing on the group dynamics of religion and human flourishing and the development of tradition-specific spiritual well-being measures. She completed her doctoral studies at Boston University's School of Public Health, where her dissertation focused on the role of faith-based and charitable health providers in the context of the broader health system. Her other public work has been in the areas of chronic disease prevention, adolescent health, mental health, and positive deviant and vulnerable communities. She's earned her Master's of Science in Public Health from the University of Utah, undergraduate degree in religion with a minor in music from Vanguard University, and joining us today from Harvard. So let's welcome Dr. Long.
Hi, good morning. It's great to be with you all. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, the joys of Zoom. All right, so I will get started. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And let's see if the slides are working. Everyone can see that okay? Okay, I'm looking for everyone's like heads are teeny, teeny, tiny. So I'm just looking for, there we go. That's better. I can understand that. All right. Wonderful. And thanks to you who are joining online. I'm resisting the urge to have us all go around and introduce each other because I really would love to know about each person here and their background. But I know we don't have a lot of time today, so I'm going to go ahead and just dive in and we can talk a little bit more at the end. So let me just see if I have control here. So the title of my talk today is Flourishing in Faith, Empirical Explorations and Future Horizons for Christian Flourishing. And so it's an honor to be here at Regent, where this is an explicit interest of yours. And it's been a joy to get to know Dr. Counted and start to work together around these exact types of questions. So what I'm going to share today is just a really high level overview of some of the work that's ongoing around the big topic of religion, spirituality, and public health. We're going to take a close, relatively brief and close look at things like forgiveness and hope, talk about some measures that have been developed from a Christian perspective and how we can use those in empirical work, and then a set of open questions about what it means to have flourishing in the church in the 21st century. So I work at Harvard's Human Flourishing program, which sits under the Institute of Quantitative Social Science. And our program really has two aims. The first is to bring together academics from a wide range of disciplines to talk about and debate and work on and as much empirical work as possible, what it means to flourish. And each discipline has a perspective on that. And oftentimes these kinds of questions are asked in silos, and then the work that's produced also takes place in silos, and then it doesn't actually ever engage with each other at the level of ideas, and certainly not at the level of content. So we try to do both. We try to engage with what it means to flourish at the level of ideas and bringing everyone around the table. And then we're also, the second aim, we're trying to do a better job of co-producing content and that really presents that synthesis well. And if you've published in academic worlds at all, you know that each field has its set of rules: word count, citation format, what they do and don't want in a discussion section, what they do and don't want in a method section. And so when you are doing interdisciplinary work that actually has used a wider range of ideas or a wider range of methods, it can be very challenging to bring that to bear in published and peer-reviewed work. But that has been our attempt, and we are learning along the way of how to do that well. We learn from our critics, we learn from the people who review our papers, and we're constantly in the process of trying to create content that can be deep and meaningful and widely absorbed from people in different disciplines. So one of the areas that I focused on for a while now is this broad topic of religion, spirituality, and public health. And I imagine that for many of you in the room, at a Christian institution, this is not so much of a surprising intersection, but for all of my public health training has been in a secular space where the topic of religion and spirituality is not always top of mind. And when it's brought up in public health contexts, can be presented in a way that's a little flat, like people are religious, moving on, or it can be presented in a way that doesn't have a lot of nuance or appreciation for how religious communities have really rich sets of ideas and traditions that are not lightly held, that are held at the deepest level. And so, it's often the case that when I'm presenting to public health audiences, it's important to say that, a majority of the world's population really does identify with a particular religious tradition, and that those values are deeply held. And that when we're thinking in a public health perspective about exposures and effects, well, the exposures that people have in religious communities and in religious practices are widespread. And so it would make sense to include those in how we think about health and well-being over time. And there are many who, in many ways, I am echoing others who have gone before me in saying these things, that religion really should be considered a social determinant of health. It's a part of our social experience, our experience that takes place, that forms and shapes our health, our sense of well-being, our sense of meaning and purpose, and is worthy of empirical exploration. And many have undertaken that task to study religion and its effects on health long-term. I'll highlight a few textbooks for you in a moment, but actually thousands of studies have been done on this topic, even though it's one of those things that people think, has any work been done? And then it turns out an enormous amount of work has been done. And over the last few years has been synthesized at a new level. And there are a wide range of effects on health outcomes and well-being outcomes, everything from all-cause mortality to depression, suicide, cancer survival, life satisfaction, subjective well-being. Religion and spirituality have a role to play and do play a powerful role in people's lives, and these other things that we broadly care about when it comes to health and well-being. One of the strongest predictors of subsequent health and well-being is religious service attendance. Another way we talk about that is religious community participation. There is something that happens when groups of people gather together to worship. And, for someone like myself, maybe like a lot of you that grew up going to church, the recommendation to participate in religious community at first seemed a little like meh. But then as you look at the research, as you see the associations, the things that happen when people attend at the highest level of frequency, which is once a week or more, there are measurable effects on reduced risk of death, for example, reduced risk of suicide, depression, divorce, deaths of despair in certain populations, adolescent depression, and the list goes on. The Christianity Today article I put up there was written by my boss and a colleague, so Tyler Vanderweel, and a colleague of mine, Brendan Case, who's one of our theologians at the program, making the public health case that when we have empty pews, it is actually a public health crisis because of the way that religious service participation promotes better health and well-being across a range of factors. So throughout the presentation today, I've tried to draw your attention to some publications or resources that might be an area of interest if you'd like to go deeper on anything I touch on today. But I highly commend this article to you if this is an area of interest. Another broad question is, okay, there's thousands and thousands of studies, yippee skippy, are they good studies? Is it empirical evidence that we can really lean on? And for people in, secular medicine, public health, there can be a sense of resistance to this work because it feels a little bit like proselytization, or it feels a little bit like there's an agenda behind it. And so I think it's important to try to look at the empirical evidence as fairly and as rigorously as possible to say, okay, what do we really know about the effects of religion, spirituality, and health? So this is a paper that came out last year in 2022 in JAMA. And it was a systematic review of empirical literature that had been published between the year 2000 and 2022. Originally, we only looked at up to 2020, but the paper took so long to get finished that we ended up having to add 2 extra years at the end, which was real fun. And I'll tell you why, because every one of those thousands of papers, there were over 15,000 we had to review initially, had to be read, at least the abstracts, by 2 people. So I was one of those readers. I went through 2 pregnancies reading abstracts. I mean, that's not all I did, but it was a lot of what I did. And you're reading these abstracts because we had certain criteria for inclusion, meaning we would include it in the systematic review or we would set it aside. And we had to set aside some really interesting studies, but in order to create synthesis, we needed to go for studies that had the highest level of rigor, which for different categories meant a large enough sample size or a certain kind of methodological approach that would allow us to make kind of stronger statements about the evidence. So in total, of the over 8,000 plus studies that we looked at for serious illness, we had to remove a lot of duplicates, so the number was even higher originally. There were 371 articles that we included in this bucket of serious illness, a majority of which had a low to moderate risk of bias. And then of the 6,000 plus articles that had to do with population health, 215 met inclusion criteria. And 66% had low to moderate risk of bias. So, okay, you got this pile of articles, super interesting. What are you going to do with all that? And so we, and that was the royal we, really our lead author, Tracy Balboni, Tyler Vanderbilt, and Howard Koh put together a Delphi panel, which is a panel of experts that know this content, know the empirical work, and review it together. It was 27 experts to look at all of these studies, and there were tables and tables of studies, and came together through a multiple layered process to say what kinds of evidence-based statements can we really make based on the strength of the evidence. And in the end, there were 6 statements that they were able to make based on empirical evidence, 3 in the domain of population health and 3 in the domain of serious illness. In the population health category, it was things like, we actually probably need to incorporate patient-centered and evidence-based approaches to encouraging religious community participation for those who identify as spiritual religious, because, man, it seems that this really does improve health and well-being. We probably also need to increase the awareness of this work among public health professionals, and we probably should recognize spirituality as a social factor that is important in health, in research, in community assessment, and program implementation. On the serious illness side, the strength of the evidence suggested that there is a need to incorporate spiritual care for patients who face serious illness, including people who've had specialty training in spiritual care, like chaplains. And that when chaplains are involved in the spiritual care of patients with serious illness, and all of this comes with the caveat of for patients who request it, or for patients for whom spirituality and religion are an important part of their life, this could really be a benefit and a way to help them navigate those toughest moments in life. The same set of colleagues that worked on this project, a good chunk of them we are working on a follow-up paper to this to actually explore at a national level, national, state, and local levels, to what degree are these recommendations being implemented, and what have they learned across decades of implementation. I think when a lot of our colleagues encounter this kind of content, it's like, well, that sounds great, but what do you do with it? Who's done it well? Who's doing it in a way that could be replicated? How are health systems thinking about costs? It's like, you can say that these things should happen, but who's paying for it? So these are the kinds of questions that we're exploring right now and trying to put forward in upcoming issues that talk about the future of public health and how we can be more attentive to religious and spiritual factors in health. If this is something that kind of makes you excited and you want to learn more, these are 4 textbooks. There are more, but these are 4 that are my go-tos for content about this kind of literature and really thinking about these things specifically from a public health or a population health perspective. So this just came out, the Religion of a Handbook of Religion and Health. It's the 3rd edition. Religion as a Social Determinant of Health was written by Ellen Eidler at Emory, and it really was one of the first substantive pieces of work that say, hey, if we're thinking about population health, we really do need to consider religion as a factor in that. Religion and the Health of the Public, written by Gary Gunderson and James Cochran, is a really thoughtful long form piece of work that describes how these things play out globally and really features the work that's taken place in the African context and how there are a range of religious health assets that need to be understood and appreciated in population health efforts. And then finally, this more recent textbook that came out in 2018, Why Religion and Spirituality Matter for Public Health, is a wonderful collection, a synthesis of evidence, and also highlights a number of schools of public health and other programs that are looking at this explicitly in a public health context. So I commend all of these works to you if this is an area of interest. So that's all great, but then there's a deeper question that takes place, which is, can we work towards a better understanding of particular religious concepts or practices and their effect on health and well-being? This in and of itself could be a semester-long course, but I'm just going to highlight 2 topics that get a little bit closer to answering that question. The first is work on forgiveness that I know others on this call and in the room have worked on as well. Just this last year, we're starting to learn results from a large randomized control trial that took place in 5 countries, over 4,500 participants, using an intervention of a forgiveness handbook. And this study has found that forgiveness does show decreased anxiety and depression for people who undertake a 2-hour handbook on meditating on what it would mean to forgive their enemies. And there's a lot of really thoughtful work in the forgiveness space. A lot of it lands in the psychology and positive psychology space about what forgiveness is, what it isn't, what its limits are. And those of us in public health who've encountered this work have really become excited by these ideas and have written about how forgiveness is really potentially a public health issue. If it is improving people's health and well-being at population levels, maybe we should think about this and large-scale interventions. And so this randomized control study was a really big step forward in looking at what that is like. The full published paper is, I think, yet to be released, but there's quite a bit out there that's summarizing the work. So I commend that to you and Ev Worthington's work in general with his Reach Forgiveness model. In partnership with Ev and other colleagues at the program, we undertook some studies from the Nurses Health Study data, looking at what forgiveness of others meant over a multiple year period of time. This study had over 50,000 participants. This is nurses, so female population, not nationally representative, so there's qualifiers on this, but we undertook 3 studies. What does it mean to forgive others, to forgive yourself, and to receive forgiveness from God? How does that affect health and well-being over time? And in all 3 of these studies, we saw effects in particularly psychological well-being and psychological distress. Namely, that there was increased psychological well-being and reduced psychological distress for those who forgave the most frequently. So this is an attempt, an example. I've listed all these papers at the end of my slides, and I'm happy to share them so you can look at them more closely. But an attempt to say, how would we look at this at a population level? Forgiveness is not a topic that, again, it shows up a lot in population health or public health literature, but we can look at it in unique ways. There are limitations to studies like this that are these kind of massive cohort studies. One of the biggest limitations is that they're often only asking a single item. How frequently do you forgive others? How frequently do you forgive yourself? How frequently do you receive forgiveness from God? Whereas the bigger body of forgiveness literature would say, whoa, there's so much more we need to know about the nature of forgiveness and the nature of the offense and all of these kinds of things. So the work really does need to sit in conversation with other pieces of work in order to tell a more comprehensive story. Nonetheless, it was an opportunity to learn how forgiveness plays out at a population level. And we saw some very interesting effects. I will point you to one really, really fun one. There was a slight increase in all-cause mortality for those who, I'm looking at, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this slight increase here, it didn't hold when we used Bonferroni correction, which means when we were looking at it under the most stringent circumstances, but it did make us pause and say, oh, that's interesting that there's the slight increase in mortality for those who always forgave themselves. And what was fascinating in this project is we wrote the paper in concert with a philosopher and a theologian. They said, oh, yes, there are things that we can talk about with this. And this kind of complicated relationship between the need to forgive yourself and receive forgiveness from God, but also the way that forgiveness, there might be wisdom in not always rushing to forgive oneself, but also reflecting on the state of how what we've done could be improved, and really meditating on the wrong itself and not just kind of like writing off our own wrongs too easily, because that might in some way be a permissiveness towards our own behavior that's harmful and might elevate the kind of risks that can affect our mortality. So these are the kinds of debates that are really interesting to have when you write with a multidisciplinary team of authors. And this was just one example of some very fun conversations that happened behind the scenes. And then we had to figure out how to say that for a publication in epidemiology context. So these are fun tasks. This is, again, you can see the associations are very similar in the same set of domains across these three forms of forgiveness. There wasn't as much effect on physical health or health behaviors, but we saw a lot going on in the psychological domain. Another area of work that we've undertaken is an exploration of hope, and looking again, what can we examine about hope at population health levels? How can we learn about its effect on subsequent health and well-being over time? And so one of the first swings we took at this was using data from the health and retirement study. So we had a sample of close to 13,000 where we looked at people who said that they had various levels of hope, and then we looked at how that affected their health and well-being over time. And here again, we saw that those who reported the highest levels of hope had greater psychological well-being and lower levels of psychological distress over time. There was some effect up here in physical health and health behaviors, but there was something about hope that really seemed to be at work in people's psychological lives and in their sense of distress. Building on this work, we're have a paper that will be coming out, I think, in the next few months, hopefully, that looks at the same kind of question in an adolescent population. So here are samples over 11,000. We followed the students over, that was again a rural this was not a data set I created myself. These students were followed over 12 years. The average age, the first wave was age 15. And so here again, we're seeing that higher levels of hope in adolescence. So at the adolescent stage, once they get to adulthood, there are higher levels of cognition and self-rated health, less physical inactivity, less depression, less perceived stress, greater happiness, more satisfaction with parenting, increased voting and volunteering. It's a really interesting range of outcomes that we're seeing. To do each of these papers I've talked about, we're using a method called the outcome-wide method, which looks at a single exposure and how it plays out on a range of things in people's lives over time. And I think that this paper, looking at hope, is particularly important as we're seeing such high and concerning rates of hopelessness and a sense of despair in younger generation, increased suicidality, we have to figure out how to cultivate hope in the lives of young people. And our hope is that papers like this that point to the way that hope has a positive role in people's lives over time can kind of further infuse the work that is ongoing in adolescent health. Okay, so these are very interesting things, but both of the two topics I presented on forgiveness and on hope were still framed in fairly general terms and used in these large cohort studies to explore how these things play out in people's lives broadly. But there is a sense in which those particular ideas, forgiveness and hope, and other ideas take on different texture, different feature when you look at them through an explicitly Christian lens. And we kind of approach this work with a both and sensibility, which is to say you have to ask these questions in a general way for the general public. These things matter for all people, and we want to understand them and how they play out at the population health level. And we're also curious about the unique ways that Christian populations would think about these ideas and how those ideas would probably show up differently in the wording that we would use in surveys, or even the conceptual definitions that we would use to say, this is how we define hope generally, and then here's how hope might be defined when you're saying it through an explicitly Christian lens, or theological hope would be another way of saying that. So this work has led us to think carefully about, I'm just highlighting two projects here. The first is tradition-specific measurements of spiritual well-being. There are measures of spiritual well-being, for example, that are attempt to be broadly useful for general populations, but they irritate people for two reasons. The first reason they irritate people is that they tend to sound too Christian. So people who are not Christian are like, why are you asking about religious service attendance? This is not how everyone worships, da, 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 da. So that, there's that critique. And then for people who are Christian, they're like, this isn't Christian enough. I would never say this kind of thing. And so there's this kind of tension when you get to the level of spiritual well-being, or how spirituality plays out in people's lives, where people are listening for something that sounds more familiar to their experience or to their tradition. And to do this work, or to expand on the wonderful work that's already been done, there is likely the need to develop measures that are tradition specific. Now, if any of you have grown up in the Christian world, and I'm assuming many of you have, you know that Christianity itself is highly diverse, and there is no one way to talk about these things. So even the attempt to create tradition-specific models also has caveats. It will in of itself not be sufficient in every Christian context, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean you can't try to create things that are useful and move that needle forward. And so we've put forward an initial 30-item set that would be useful in Christian contexts, and potentially useful to understand the features of the Christian spiritual life. Those set of items have been used in an ongoing study, a longitudinal study that is hosted by Duke, that is working with Catholic student ministries at 5 universities across the country. So we're excited to be learning from those results in the coming years, as that data comes in, and as we're able to understand how Christian spiritual well-being in college played out over time into early adulthood. Another area of work, and the chapters I've listed here are featured in these textbooks. So Measuring Well-Being is a wonderful volume. The Christian Spiritual Well-Being is just one chapter in a whole set. So again, if this is of interest, that's a great resource for you. More recently, in the Handbook of Positive Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality, we put forward an attempt to synthesize what we know so far about the effect of the theological virtues, so faith, hope, and love, on subsequent health and well-being. And because very little empirical work has attempted to measure theological hope, theological faith, theological love, we had to really look at proxy measures to kind of synthesize what's known so far, but ultimately move towards the idea that if these things matter for health and for well-being, then we very likely need to refine the way we define and measure these things. And so that has led us to a working group at the Human Flourishing program focused on the theological virtues. And that kind of sits alongside a broader initiative at our program to better define and measure love and the various forms of love. So the love of neighbor, the love of parent, the love of spouse, and very interestingly, the love of enemy and the love of God. So these are fascinating conversations. It's my favorite part of the job to sit and debate these ideas and how you even put them into words and then use them in survey and item development. Okay, so these are kind of the stepping stones that get us to this next project that I'd like to just share with you briefly as I wrap up today. So if we know that religious communities matter, if we know that religious participation matters in the health and well-being of individuals and in society, and if we know that there is work taking place and ongoing around tradition-specific measures, how do these things come together and how does that inform our thinking in the 21st century? And that has led me and others to think about this topic of flourishing in the church specifically and saying, can we bring new tools to bear to explore what it means to flourish in our time and use these tools both to learn about the church, but also help build the church and help it understand the kinds of things that promote flourishing and can be useful in ministry and in practice as we proceed further into the 21st century. So some key questions here that we're currently wrestling with is, again, what does it mean for the Christian church to flourish? What do such church communities look like? And what factors lead to its flourishing? This is a project that I really just began personally over the summer. So it's very new. And my first task was really to speak to all the many brilliant and hardworking people who've been working on this for decades and beyond, and becoming aware of just so much good work that is already underway, including work at your own university with Dr. Counted and others, and saying, how can we work together to approach this kind of question? How can we take what's already been done and build on it? And what are our other opportunities? And so over the last few months, we've really identified 4 areas of opportunity for the future. And the first really is to synthesize what is already known about flourishing in the church. Of course, there are theological tomes written on such things, but there also has been empirical work undertaken looking specifically at church networks, congregational studies, some that have made it into the literature, many that have not. How can we use the existing data to learn and to make our future questions more informed? The second opportunity is to develop relationships with church networks that are interested in the use of measurement, particularly measurement over time. One of the great privileges of being at the Human Flourishing program is I've encountered these groups over the years, and I think I didn't realize I was taking notes every time I was meeting with people of faith who were coming and saying, help us do measurement, but I was internally taking notes. And I think there's real opportunities to support church networks that want to do this work. They want support. They want to do it well. They don't want to use kind of silly data. They want to use data that they can really talk about. And so that's an opportunity. The third opportunity with a lot of this is to promote deeper dialogue between theology and social science. Unfortunately, it seems that sometimes data efforts that take place within the church only stay in the church, and they do the work they're meant to do, but they often can't really be useful in peer-reviewed literature or in contexts that are not really supportive of the church. Meanwhile, over here in social science, there's a lot of work thinking about religion, spirituality, health, all this kind of stuff, but it isn't always connected to religious communities themselves. It isn't always in dialogue with how these things play out in practice. And so this divide can be very limiting and doesn't always need to be there. There are opportunities to build bridges and to make the empirical work taking place in the church achieve a higher standard, such that it can be really useful in practical ministry, because you can put more weight on it And it also can be useful for sharing to outside audiences to share more about what it is about the church and the life of faith that really leads to certain types of flourishing, and maybe doesn't lead to certain types of flourishing in others. This is just an aside, but I think when we start to talk about flourishing and the Christian faith, it requires a conversation about suffering and the difference between flourishing in the present life and flourishing in the life to come, and thinking about temporal versus eternal categories of flourishing. And so this deeper dialogue actually opens up a whole new world and an opportunity to think more broadly and more holistically about what it means to flourish. And then the fourth opportunity is to promote research that follows church networks over time. Again, a lot of the work tends to be what we call cross-sectional. It's a point in time, and that's useful, but you don't get to see what happens over time. And until you look at what happens over time with something called longitudinal work, you really aren't able to make stronger claims about relationships between A and B, or X and Y, or however you want to say it. So that longitudinal piece allows for a higher level of rigor and more strength and more clarity about relationships between these factors. I'll close on this last slide in saying that as we've been in these early conversations about flourishing in the church, and I've been talking with different people and learning about their work and learning about how we're conceiving of this, it's become clear to our group that there are possibly three dimensions of flourishing in the church. There's the flourishing of individual Christians. So that's at the personal level. And those individuals then form congregations. So the flourishing of this kind of collective at the organizational level. But then there's also this piece that through flourishing congregations, that leads to action in the community. And so at an ideal level, flourishing Christians should lead and link to flourishing congregations and lead to flourishing communities. And it is very likely that those three dimensions are not just linear, like A, B, C, that there's actually some loops and some connections between them. And that is an area that I'm very curious to learn more about. What are those connections over time between these domains? How do we measure such things? Something that's very compelling to many pastors and leaders is saying, yeah, we want to talk more about what we're doing outside of our church walls and how we're serving the community, how we're loving people in need. And typically churches don't tell their stories with data in that way. And they certainly, even if they do tell the story with data in their own context, they're not always using common measures with other churches or faith-based organizations. And so it tends to be a very scattered picture that makes it very difficult to make high-level statements, even at the lightest level, like, what are we doing? And how much of it are we doing? And these kinds of things. But more so, it makes it very difficult to talk about impact and to talk about what the church is doing in the world to groups of people that are not necessarily rooting for the church's continuation in society. And so these things are important for our own learning, empirically, for learning within the church, and again, for strengthening of the church in the future. So next steps, areas we're focused on with this project are very similar to those opportunities I described. Synthesizing current knowledge. We're currently working on some material that is co-produced between the Human Flourishing Program, Regent, Baylor University, to say what do we know so far and where are the opportunities to grow. The second piece of work is building networks, relationships with church networks to see how we might be able to do some new item development, data collection with church networks that are already invested in these things and who can really partner with us in this work. And then also achieving some conceptual clarity. As I've talked about earlier, there is a lot of work our group undertakes along with other groups to really focus on the wording of items, which can feel incredibly tedious, but it matters so much when you start to use it in practice and you get all this data in. It really matters what you were asking and how you asked it in order to make the end statements accurate. So there's some work to say, what's our conception of flourishing in the church? What items will we use to measure such things? And then how do we deploy them in a way that is meaningful and complements all the existing work that is ongoing related to flourishing in the church, because we don't have time to duplicate. So let's be additive and complementary wherever possible. So I will end there and just open it up for questions. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
Kate, would you please put up your slide about the key questions again?
Yes. Well, I have to find where my slides went. Just a second. The key opportunities, I think, is that what you're...
I think you said 3 key questions. There's a slide.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Let me go back there. These key questions.
What does it mean for the Christian church to flourish? Kate, I really have enjoyed your presentation. My question to you is that have your group worked with Flourishing and the African American churches?
We've not done that as an explicit project. Some of the work that we've encountered, for example, GLUE and Barna have done surveying work with African American churches specifically. National Congregation Study has studied African American churches, but I think the flourishing items we use and this approach is still relatively new, but there's a lot of opportunities there.
Okay.
And I think we
talk. You're unmuted now.
okay. If I'm to add to that, I think we're also kind of open to ongoing conversations with other groups as well.
Yeah.
Especially as we start to think about flourishing in the church, the project itself, and what that will look like. So, and I know that Dr. Gilbert is very tied to the African American church community, so we are lead person for that.
Thank you, Dr. Long, for your presentation. With the literature, social scientific literature for speak up, yeah. Thanks for your presentation. So with the empirical literature on flourishing in the church, you said there has been some empirical work done. So I'd be curious on some examples of that. So maybe we could dig into that. And then also flourishing would need to have some sort of teleology or telos to it in order to define the parameters of what flourishing is. So I'm wondering how that literature has understood what flourishing is and maybe operationalized it.
Yeah, good questions. So to the first piece of your work or first piece of your question about current work, it's kind of a range. You have groups like Barna and GLUE who do kind of more cross-sectional studies on the modern, largely evangelical church that have actually used our flourishing items and are able to kind of paint pictures of what the church looks like under those parameters. They also add their own items on thriving leaders, and they've created dashboards and tools. I think it's a really helpful starting point and very useful and practical ministry so far. But it's sometimes limited by not following churches over time or not asking other questions in concert that might give more context to the church environment or the parameters or what we're working with in a bigger sense. Then there's theological work, as you mentioned. Miroslav Volf is one who've been writing about what does it mean to flourish in the church, but there's often not item development tied to those theological reflections on flourishing in the church. And so part of our project upcoming is to try to bring these things in conversation with one another, bring theologians and philosophers to the table who deeply understand not just the more recent reflections on flourishing in the church, but also what does that conversation look like historically? And what are our parameters? Our attempt is to be as ecumenical as possible, but really centered on historic Christian conceptualization of these things, and doing that with as much kind of integrity and wisdom as possible to keep all of these competing priorities in balance. So what is empirically useful? practical to ministry, but also reflective of these rich ideas and deep meditation on scripture and the history of the church.
Other questions?
No, I was just curious about, hi, Dr. Long, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Sounds like a lot of good work is going on. I am curious as far as what have efforts looked like? If there have been any so far working with families who are affected by neurodivergence, because I know a few articles, at least 10 years ago, were talking about negative experiences with religious community and participation. So I'm wondering what kind of factors you've come across in your research.
With neurodivergence in particular, or?
Yeah. So either individuals or family units.
Yeah, so I that's not an area.
Their experience of a religious community.
Oh, okay. That's not an area I've looked at in particular. The studies that we highlight in general are these kind of nationally representative studies, these large cohort studies that are certainly saying not that every individual experiences these positive effects, but that on the whole, when you look at it in kind of in net, then you do see these positive effects of religious service attendance and participation. And we are always very careful to say three things actually. The first is that at least when you're talking to secular audiences and people for whom religion and spirituality is potentially even offensive topic, it's that for those for whom religion and spirituality are important features in life, then religious service participation could be a very meaningful way to engage and promote one's health and well-being. The second thing is always bearing in mind that there have been many ways that religious communities have harmed people, and we have to be mindful about that and really include it in almost everything we write, that this is not something that has been just this like overwhelmingly positive thing in many people's lives. There's a million different ways people have been hurt by the church or felt excluded or explicitly sexually harmed by religious leaders. So that work, I have to say, there has not been really rigorous, to my knowledge, work trying to assess that aspect of religious harm at a population level, though there are many studies that look at religious and spiritual distress, for example, or negative experiences in religious communities. There's a lot of qualitative work also that has looked at that. But when you start to look at it from the 30,000 foot view with large sample sizes, cohort level studies over time, you do see these positive associations. And I think that's just helpful to sit in tension with the many examples of ways that religion can also be a harmful or negative factor in people's lives as well. And I think with all this work, including Flourishing in the Church and new initiatives, we have to be rigorous in the sense that we're not overly rosy, but nor are we overly negative. And sometimes it's like, it feels like A or B is the option, like full-throated advocacy or like, we don't like this at all. And so I think the answer is to try to be attentive to the critique, but also curious about the possibilities and how these things work. Matt Lee, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Kate. Wonderful talk. And I really appreciate the care that you're exhibiting when you try to frame the meaning of various findings. You know, the Fetzer Institute just came out with a major new national survey of spirituality in the United States, and I was able to comment on that. Our colleague Richard had some comments as well. And you know, I'll put this in the chat box if this is of interest to anyone. You can click on the link. But one of the points that I highlighted in my remarks was this finding that only 12% of the US population reported that their well-being improved after the COVID pandemic. And this set of what I termed flourishing despite adversity respondents were more likely to consider themselves very or moderately spiritual. So I think that's worth digging into, but we don't exactly know what it means. And to your point about suffering, and this is where I think your talk really sets me up nicely for what I'll say to this group in January about love and flourishing, how we frame flourishing or suffering, or the interconnection of both, or the transcendence of suffering towards flourishing depends a lot on our cultural grids. And I was remembering a friend of mine when I was in high school, his mother was killed in a car accident. And some of us friends went over to his house in the immediate aftermath of this. And his father was a pastor of a Christian church and was essentially saying, hallelujah, she's been reunited with God. And some of my friends, I was just sort of in shock, so I just sat there. But some of my friends were quite angry that their friend was suffering and couldn't grieve his mom because of this happy spin.
Yeah.
This, today we would use the word spiritual bypassing, but who are we to judge? I mean, so this is what I'm left with. His perspective was valid for him. Was it fully compassionate to his son? Those are two different questions. And so when we think about flourishing and the ultimate aim is one of the questions brought up, what are we aiming at in the temporal world and in the eternal world? And so I think you've exercised a lot of care with how you have framed that. And I think we need to dig into those questions more deeply moving forward. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to what we might find, especially in the Love Project.
Yes. Thank you.
And you have a
Yes.
question, then we'll wrap up that.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Long, for your presentation, I really appreciated it. My question kind of, goes with, what, Mr. Lee was talking about in that post-pandemic, we've seen a decrease in church attendance in the physical aspects, but I was wondering if any of your research, it had any indications towards church communities that are online or that are experiencing church through technology rather than actually being in the church spaces, and if that has any kind of impact or the same impact as it would be had they gone into an actual church building.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, most of the religious service attendance work that's happened to date, of course, is assumed in-person attendance. But yes, now we have this whole other dimension of participation in this virtual space that does appear to be here to stay. Early work that I'm aware of, and Matt, you might be able to speak to this as well, has found a couple of things. One is that it really is a meaningful form of participation for those who are living with disabilities, for those who have something going on in their life that keeps them away from participation. Different ethnic and minority communities seem to gravitate towards it more, especially during COVID, being a way of remaining engaged, but also remaining physically safe in the process. So it is a real, can be a real benefit for some groups. At the same time, I think when you look at it on the whole, we're not seeing the same level of positive effects that you see for in-person service attendance. So there is likely, from what we know so far, something about being together physically in person, mind, body, and spirit. But that will have to sit next to the research that's saying, hey, for some groups, this is really important and allows for a form of engagement that otherwise would have been completely off the table. I'll say anecdotally, in my own experience, I had 2 children during COVID, and I was so grateful for online options. I would, there's no way I would have engaged all during those times. So personally, I've experienced that. And I think many people in congregations have experienced that. And I also think that the empirical work going forward will really grow with attention to what does online participation. And then there's various forms of online participation. Is it exclusive? Is it hybrid? Is it one-off? And how do these different dose response relationships affect subsequent health and well-being? So I think stay tuned on that one, probably.
Well, thank you, Dr. Long, for sharing with us today. We really enjoyed it and appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to all of you online as well. Happy to share my email and be in touch with anyone who would like to talk about these things further.
Thank you.